Good evening, George.
Comrades, hello. Can you hear me? Apologies, hopefully my internet's going to be sorted out now.
We can hear you loud and clear, Joti.
Great. Was my video all right?
The video is fine.
Good, good.
So if you will take the lead with sharing, then I'll leave it to you to unmute the speakers in turn.
Yeah, great.
Okay.
I will do that.
I'm going to mute myself now.
Okay, give me 1 sec. Will I just set up the business? There we go. There we go. Got everybody. Rob, do you want to tell me when we should go live?
It's 8 o'clock now. We're streaming, so you can begin.
Great, thank you. Welcome, honoured guests, comrades and friends to tonight's meeting. We're marking this evening the 67th anniversary of the assault on the Moncada Barracks, which was led by Fidel Castro and his comrades on 26th of July, 1953. Led by Fidel Castro. Although that attack was unsuccessful, Fidel gave one of his most famous speeches during the trial that followed it, a speech that has become known throughout the world from his closing words, La historia me absolverá, history will absolve me. And how right he was proved to be. Fidel used that speech to expose the brutality of the military regime of Fulgencio Batista, who was ruling over the Cuban people at that time with an iron fist on behalf of his masters in the USA. He exposed the downtrodden existence of the Cuban people, and he championed not only their need, but also their right to fight for liberty and freedom by whatever means necessary. And in that trial, he also outlined 5 revolutionary laws that he would have proclaimed if the attack had been successful. And these were the first goals of the Cuban Revolution. These were to return power to the people, to give ownership of land to the tenants, to grant workers and employees the right to share the profits of large industry, to grant all the sugar planters the right to share the profits of sugar production, and to confiscate all holdings and ill-gotten gains of the previous regimes. And Fidel believed that half of the property that was thus recovered should be used to subsidize retirement funds for workers, and the other half should go towards setting up hospitals, asylums, and social organizations that would meet the needs of the poor. So these were the first basic demands of the Cuban revolutionary movement, which grew throughout the 1950s and resulted ultimately in the overthrow of Batista's regime on the 1st of January 1959, 5.5 years after the Moncada Barracks had lit the fire of revolution in Cuba. So Cuba and Cuban socialism have come a long way since then, in so many ways. I'm not going to enunciate them now. I'm going to hand over without further ado to our very special guest speaker, Ambassador Barbara Montalvo Alvarez of the Cuban Embassy in London. Ambassador, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. We are very grateful for that. I'd ask you to unmute yourself if you can, and hand over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. First, I must apologize because I won't be able to participate until the end of this meeting due to imperative work commitments, as I have already explained to the organizers. Right now, the Cuban president is taking part in the 30th anniversary of the Sao Paulo Forum. I'm sure there will be another opportunities to exchange, but I wanted to honor my commitment with all of you. Dear comrades of the Workers' Party of Britain, dear friends, to join us today. Many thanks to the Workers' Party for organizing this event to commemorate the 67th anniversary of the attack on the Moncada Barracks, as Joti expressed. 16 years ago, a group of 135 young men headed by Fidel Castro played a leading role in one of the most heroic and significant moments of our history, the attack of Moncada Barracks, the second most important military fortress in the country, with 1,000 soldiers. It took place in 1953, marking the centenary of the birth of our national hero, José Martí. In fact, 3 actions were taken simultaneously: the attack on Moncada Barracks and the occupation of Saturnino Lora Military Hospital in Santiago de Cuba, and the attack on Carlos Manuel de Céspedes Barracks in Bayamo. Moncada Barracks was selected because it was on the southern coast of that eastern province, near the sea and surrounded by mountains. The objective was to occupy the barracks, distribute the weapons among the population, and call on them to continue the fight from Sierra Maestra. The surprise factor was lost and the military action failed, but it had an extraordinary impact on the Cuban future. A period of armed fight started and only ended with the defeat of tyranny and the triumph of the revolution in January 1st, 1959. Few casualties resulted from the combat, but the most attackers were brutally tortured and murdered. This action was the beginning of the last stage of the fight for our true independence, a single historic process initiated on October 10, 1866, with our independence war against Spanish colonialism resumed in 1895 under Jose Marti leadership. The victory of our heroic soldiers of the Liberation Army, which had defeated the Spanish army in the battlefield, the most powerful army during that period, was stolen by the US military intervention. They occupied our country, humiliated the Liberation Army, and imposed the mediated republic. But generations of Cubans continued fighting in several and diverse circumstances. Since then, all the temporary defeats, setbacks, and backward movements in the prolonged effort to be free once and for all were steps leading to the events that took place that July 26. In his defense, history will absolve me, as Joti mentioned, Fidel not only denounced murders, corruption, the severe crisis affecting all sectors of domestic life, but also listed the main postulates of the revolutionary program: agrarian reform, comprehensive educational reform, free health services for everyone, nationalization of properties owned by foreign monopolies, industrialization, and solidarity with the peoples of Latin America. And Fidel kept all his promises. What was Cuba in 1953? It was an underdeveloped country, monoproducer, exporting raw materials, with high rates of unemployment, infant mortality, and illiteracy, offering neither protection to workers nor essential health coverage to its population. And what is Cuba now? It is a developing country, moving forward despite exogenous factors hindering our efforts. We have a free health system accessible to the entire population, an infant mortality rate of 5 deaths per 1,000 live births, the lowest rate in Latin America, which ensures the immunization of its child population against 13 preventable diseases. We have a free education system, including special education, sports and artistic education, an unemployment rate of 1.2%, where more than 60% of the university graduates and more than 68% of the professional technical workforce are women, with a recognized scientific and biotechnical development protecting workers and the elderly. We have a country that does not apply neoliberal regimes and does not leave any of its citizens abandoned to their fate. Fidel declared that Jose Marti was the intellectual author of the Moncada, the man who founded a single party to lead the Second War of Independence, who united wills, a man of anti-imperialist and solidary thought. Marti taught us that without the unity of all Cubans, we would be defeated, and that one just principle from the depths of a cave is more powerful than an army. In Fidel, Martí had the best interpreter of his ideas. We have never renounced those anti-imperialist principles of national unity and solidarity. July 26 marks the day of the rebellion, of the national rebellion, to honor the heroes and martyrs of Moncada, who are a benchmark of courage and patriotism for current and future generations of Cubans. Thus, 165 young rebels multiplied, and today we are a cultured and determined people who do not accept surrender or defeat, capable of resisting and facing any challenge, which does not hesitate before the powerful enemy, which does not give what is left over, but shares what it has, and does not give up the dream to building a prosperous and sustainable socialist society. Since that morning on July 26, 1953, Cuba has been paying a very high price for its sovereignty in the face of an empire that today, like never, is displaying all its power to subdue us. But here we are, encouraged by the example of those who gave their lives, accompanied by the solidarity of millions of people around the world. We continue working to improve the well-being of our people and protecting them against all adversity, fulfilling the sacred duty of helping other peoples who need our support, wherever they may be, with our modest resources, and without asking for anything in return. All that remains for me to express is our immense gratitude to everyone who in the United Kingdom encourage and support us in this colossal and glorious battle. Thank you very much.
Beautiful, Ambassador. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us and for giving such an inspiring background to the events of Moncada and the achievements of the Cuban people since the revolution. The Cuban Revolution is something which is close to the hearts of all of us in the Workers' Party, as much as it is, I think, to even the people of Cuba, because it represents a beacon to us of what people can achieve when they truly gain their independence and liberty. And just for our wider audience, as well as our members, I wanted to reiterate the information that the ambassador gave us there at the beginning, that at the same time as we're holding this meeting, unfortunately, we didn't know about the clash, or we wouldn't have scheduled it this way, but the 30th anniversary of the Sao Paulo Forum is being marked right now with the participation of the presidents of Cuba, of Venezuela, of Nicaragua, and I think also the former president of Brazil, Lula da Silva. So it's a very important meeting. It is available on the internet, and I will encourage all of our members and supporters to go and look at that broadcast. It's available in 4 languages, including English, at the Sao Paulo Forum's website, and we'll circulate the link to that after this broadcast. Thank you very much again, Ambassador. And our next speaker is Gui Rivaud. To our members, he needs no introduction, but for the benefit of those in our internet audience who are not familiar with his work, Gui is an extremely talented film and television actor, originally from France, but living and working for many years here in Britain. He's also a long-time Cuba solidarity activist and a leading member of our party down in the Southwest. So Gui, welcome. I would ask you please to unmute yourself and give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Joti. I hope you can all hear me. Good evening, comrades. This is all great. First of all, may I thank you all for for having me this evening for this meeting. It is a great honor to share the platform with so wonderful people. Joti, deputy leader. George is probably with his lovely lady. My thoughts are with him, as his lady is due to give birth to his sixth child. So we send you lots of love, George, and obviously to the Cuban ambassador in the UK, Her Excellency Barbara Montalvo Alvarez. I've only got 5 minutes. I've been given 5 minutes, so I will not dive too deep on things. But I just wanted to tell you very briefly my relationship with Cuba, why I love Cuba, and why Cuba needs help at the minute. So on the personal level, my love for Cuba started in 1996 when I took my first trip there to Cayacoco. That was at the time where Cuba was in big difficulties financially, and when Fidel realized that tourism will be a very important, factor for the Cuban economy. So between 1996 and 2003, I did 4 trips to Cuba. I haven't been there for 17 years, cracky. I'm planning another big trip, hopefully for my 50th birthday in 3 years. But, you know, when you meet people in the streets, when you meet, even when you talk to relatives about Cuba, some people that you will be talking to will be ill-informed, a little bit ignorant about the topic, and they will have been fed wrong information coming from the mainstream media or probably the US government propaganda. Cuba is not crumbling. Fidel Castro was no dictator, he was a hero, and the revolution is working. Every time you go to Cuba, you will be met by wonderful people. Everyone that you will meet will have big smiles on their face, and you will be submerged by the culture, the history, the revolution, landscapes, and people are very proud of their history in Cuba. But what people's got to realize, and I think this is where I'd like to focus on, because obviously today or yesterday, the 26th of July, 1953, marked something really important in the Cuban history. That was the beginning of the revolution. But where we are at today, what we've got to understand is that Cuba is a country that is doing pretty well, considering the circumstances they're under. For the past 60 years, the US government has imposed an illegal, unlawful, severe blockade on Cuba, which has cost the Cuban economy something like 950 billion US dollars. Can you imagine that? And it is so severe that what they're trying to do even now with the Trump administration, it is to strangle the Cuban people and the Cuban economy even further. Despite this oppression, despite this, this attack on Cuba for the past few decades, like Her Excellency was mentioning earlier on during a talk, Cuba has got one of the best, if not the best, healthcare service on the planet, with some of the best doctors and nurses around. Cuba has got one of the greatest educational program and educational system on planet Earth. And not only that, culturally, it's probably one of the best in the world, with the music and the history and the culture and the paintings and so on. As we talk right now, 2020, the world has been ravaged by the coronavirus crisis, and everybody around the world is affected. You are, I am, everybody is. And in the darkness, there has been a light. And that light in the darkness has been Cuba. Why? Because Cuba has been sending dozens and dozens of brigades all over the world, in countries like Italy, Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, and so on, helping other nations with their doctors and with their nurses to tackle the coronavirus outbreak. But not only that, right now, I believe that Cuba has 28,000 professional medicals, the doctors and nurses in 59 countries. Can you imagine? I mean, they're not just dealing with the coronavirus, they are dealing with other diseases, eradicate all of these illnesses, or assist countries that are being affected by natural disasters. So Cuba is excellent in all of these things. And how do we thank them? How did we thank Cuba in the midst of all of this adversity and whilst they were doing this? Well, we allow the US government to act like renegades, to act like cowboys. And the US government has been posing more sanctions on the Cuban government, strangling even more Cuban people. And not only that, we have allowed the US government to stop a shipment of PPE, ventilators, and testing kits coming from China to Cuba to help Cuba dealing with their own coronavirus crisis, when they've been dealing with this crisis all over the world, helping other nations to tackle and stop this disease. So let's remember as well that this blockade is inhumane, it's illegal, and it's causing a lot of harm to the Cuban people. And in November last year, for people that don't know this, the UN General Assembly, for the 28th year in a row, condemned the US blockade. Condemned the US blockade by 187 votes to 3. People's got to understand that 3 countries voted for the blockade. And these are the United States, Israel, and Brazil. So how can we allow the Trump of this world, the Borsellino, the Netanyahu, the cowboys of this world to act like they do and to punish countries like Cuba? Because Cuba is not the only country that's being punished by this US government. Actually, all the sanctions affect probably about 2 billion people around the world. So, we need to really stand with Cuba. And I'm just finishing with few facts and figures as well. I mean, Her Excellency gave few earlier on, but we celebrate the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, which started in 1953, and we look at it now, 2020. Despite what I've just told you, it might be a bit boring, but it's very important for you to know that the illegal blockade has cost the Cuban economy over 950 billion US dollars. That is a lot of money. But despite this, 53.2% of MPs in Cuba are women. This is the second highest number in the world, which is a great achievement. 35,000 students from 138 countries trained by Cuba Latin American School of Medicine since 1998. As an environmentalist, I love that next fact: 30% forest covered compared to pre-1959 figure of 11%. And I just finished with this one: 11 preventable diseases eradicated through vaccination programs. And I could go on, but Cuba is the light in the darkness around the world. So I'd like to finish with this, if I may. If you are interested about Cuba, if you'd like to learn more about Cuba, there are 3 ways that you can help Cuba. Number 1, join us at the Workers' Party. Why? Because we are the only socialist party in Britain that stand up for Cuba. We stand up for Palestine. We stand up for Venezuela. We stand up for socialism. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about Cuba, please join us. Also, there is another organization that you might want to support, in which I encourage you to support, and that is the Cuba Solidarity Campaign organization, which has been based in the UK for over 25 years. I've been a member myself. I'm a friend of Cuba Solidarity. You could join for as little as £20 per month. 20 pounds per year. Your little contribution will help Cuba Solidarity to fight the US blockade, and will help the Cuban people. And in return, you get the Cuba Sea magazine, and you get to meet some new friends and make some great connection. And lastly, when the coronavirus is over, go and visit Cuba by yourself. That would be a great way for the Cuban government to generate some money, and you will be met by many smiles, and you will have a great time in Cuba. And lastly, Joti, if I may, I would like to finish my little spiel, and I'd like to direct this to the president of Cuba, Senor Miguel Diaz-Canel, his government, and Her Excellency Barbara. And I'd like to direct this as well to all the Cuban women, men, and children watching this broadcast. We at the Workers' Party Cuba, we love you, we cherish you, we value you, and we respect you. We at the Workers' Party in Britain, we will always stand in solidarity with you against the injustice, the oppressions, and the US blockade. And I'd like to finish with this: hasta la victoria siempre. Thank you, Joti.
Beautiful, Guy. Thank you. Thank you very much for that really passionate defense of Cuba, Cuba's socialism and Cuba's gains, Cuba's liberty and independence. There's a nice little comment in the chat here from one of our members, John Maxted, who says, Cuba stands as an example of what can be achieved when a people's revolution is carried through to its completion. And of course, that is exactly why the US and the imperialists hate Cuba, why they target Cuba, why they have been trying for 70 years to strangle Cuba. They are desperate to stop the threat of the good example that Cuba radiates to the world, and especially into Latin America. You know, the ambassador talked about how the Cubans have universal access to education, to healthcare, to culture, to employment, to the gains of women's liberation, the great care that's taken of the elderly and the disabled. Nobody left behind, she told us. The Cuban Revolution planted the flag of socialism in Latin America, and for that alone, the US cannot forgive it. You know, the sphere of its reign is tiny, but the sphere of its influence is enormous. And the US knows that. The US knows that while Cuba continues to offer these things to its people and to show that there is another way, the people of Latin America have a shining beacon towards which they march, and it gives them fire and spirit in their own resistance against imperialist oppression that just can't be put out. And that's why the US has always been desperate to crush tiny little Cuba, which has a temerity to have a socialist independent republic right on its doorstep. You know, when the US thinks it's in control of the world and considers and has considered for the last 200 years Latin America to be its backyard, its personal fiefdom, its sphere of influence, the idea that Cuba, just a few miles off its coast, should have the gall to be independent and socialist to boot is an insult that really rankles with Uncle Sam. You know, the enmity is not going to cease, and yet Cuba stands up against that enmity and survives. You know, Cuba was not expected to survive after the collapse of the socialist bloc, which had been, of course, its main support and trading partner. Cuba was given, you know, a few weeks at most. The Cuban people have shown they are absolutely determined to hold on to their socialism, no matter what the difficulties, because they see how much it has gained for them. You know, and the ambassador talked also about the anti-imperialist principles of unity and solidarity that Cuba stands for. And again, this inspires and gives great assistance to people all over the world. Cuba has, in its past, even sent military assistance to people fighting in Latin America, in the Congo, in Southwest Africa. These are serious and meaningful acts for such a small country. You know, Cuba's population is only 11 million. It's a very small population with which to do so much. Guy talked a little bit about what Cuba has been able to do by way of solidarity and assistance to people in the world during this current health crisis, during the COVID pandemic. And, you know, the actions of China, of Cuba, have really thrown into sharp relief the difference in priorities between the capitalist countries, and particularly the imperialist countries, and the socialist countries. You know, a people-oriented economy, and particularly with Cuba, you know, its focus on medicine and medical assistance is something which has been well known to the world for decades already. And this pandemic has really highlighted the, you know, the difference in priorities, as I said, where in the richest countries in the world, we have in fact some of the poorest health outcomes and the most unequal health outcomes as a result of this pandemic, whilst Cuba, tiny, strangulated Cuba, has been sending doctors even to Western countries like Italy when they were in the, you know, real throes of the crisis, when the pandemic was peaking there in March, when the European Union sent no help. Cuba and China were sending doctors and supplies to help the Italian people to cope with the overwhelming of their health system. You know, this is something that workers are understanding and learning from, and these are lessons that can't be unlearned and untaught, much to the chagrin of the imperialists, of course, who try, you know, constantly to denigrate and spread lies and confusion about the reality of socialism, precisely because they want to demoralize us. They want us to believe that there's no alternative to this system. This is the best you can get. But it's not the case. You know, I remember Hurricane Katrina back in, was it 2005? My memory is not brilliant, I'm afraid. So apologies if that's the wrong year. But what I do remember very clearly was the difference in response of the USA and Cuba to that situation. The US government abandoned its own people, did nothing for them. It was mistakes by the government or what would you call it? Neglect by the government, which allowed the hurricane to wreak such devastation in the first place. They refused properly to warn people, to evacuate people. And after the hurricane had hit, they left people to drown, to die, practically to starve, and to be homeless for years afterwards. Some people still, I think, probably have never found a home since then. Look on the other side what Cuba did. At the time of Hurricane Katrina, it offered to send 1,000 doctors to the poor, stranded, homeless workers in Louisiana. They were not accepted, so that help wasn't allowed through to the victims of Hurricane Katrina. On the flip side, when a hurricane of similar force had hit Cuba just a few months earlier that year, the Cubans evacuated something like 1.5 million people out of the way of the hurricane. Not only the people, they brought with them their family doctors, they brought with them even expensive electrical goods like fridges. You know, they were able to mount a serious operation to salvage as much as possible to out of harm's way and to bring the people back to rebuild and make sure that they were okay. I think something like 6 lives were lost during that hurricane. You compare that to the toll of Hurricane Katrina, and it really shows you something about the priorities. You know, the US ruling class at Hurricane Katrina was rubbing its hands with the thought that, you know, whole areas of the city had been wiped of working class inhabitants that could now be redeveloped, and a killing was about to be made. And really that was their priority, was thinking about how to, you know, push that plan forwards rather than how to help their own people. You know, with the blockade against Cuba, the US really lifts a rock and drops it on its own feet. You know, it wants to crush Cuba, but constantly its actions rebound on itself, because the Cuban people over the decades, they have continued to respond to these attempts to crush them, to crush their revolution in constantly evolving and creative ways. You know, they When they found they couldn't get fertilizer, for example, for their agriculture because of the blockade, what did they do? They became world-leading experts in organic agriculture, do without fertilizers. When they were finding that their medical supplies are being cut off, and of course that still to this day creates huge problems for the Cuban medical system, that they have such shortage of important supplies, but they have made a point of becoming as sufficient as they possibly can, of developing a world-leading biotech and pharmaceutical industries of their own. Cuba was the first and only country to develop a vaccine against meningitis B. And it was the first country to stop transition of that HIV virus from mother to child. This was something that was recognized by the World Health Organization as a huge achievement, you know. And of course, Cuba shares these advances with the world. Cuba doesn't try to make money out of these important medical steps forward that can save lives everywhere. It helps people everywhere also to save life. You know, it's only because of our own pharmaceuticals industry's grip on government policy in this country that we don't have access to what has proved to be the safest vaccine against meningitis B, i.e. the Cuban one. You know, this is a classic example of the profit-driven approach to healthcare as opposed to a people-centered approach to healthcare. You know, the blockade means that Cuba's development is far slower than it would have been, as does the collapse, as I said earlier, of the socialist bloc in Europe. But although Cuba is not as rich and developed as it ought to be, its people have lives of dignity, equality, and meaning. And its people have shown they have absolutely no intention of giving up their hard-earned gains. And in this, we support them all the way. We are truly grateful to Cuba for everything it has done to show what people can achieve. And we are in awe of the Cuban people's spirit, their bravery, and their persistence in standing up for their own country, their own people, their own liberty and freedom, and in fighting actually for the liberty and freedom of humanity everywhere. I'm not going to say any more. I'm going to pass you over to Comrade George Galloway, leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, and our final speaker for this evening. George, over to you.
Well, Joti, and Your Excellency, Ambassador Barbara, the fantastic contributions that this meeting has already showcased, from yourself, Joti, as the deputy leader, from Gui Rivaud, one of our leaders, shows not just the strength and depth that the Workers' Party has developed in just 7 or perhaps 8 months, not even 8 months of our existence, but it shows the internationalism of the Workers' Party of Britain. We have absolutely rejected the idea that because you are determined to fight for the independence and sovereignty of your own country, that means you are turning your back on other countries. We support the Cuban Revolution because it achieved the independence and sovereignty of Cuba, and we stand for the independence and sovereignty of our own country. In that, we appear to be almost unique amongst left-wing parties in Britain, who either don't want Britain to be independent of the European Union or don't want it to be united, actually support it being broken up either explicitly or implicitly. Not for us. We believe in the indissolubility of Britain and its absolute right to sovereignty. That's why we fought for Brexit, and it's why we oppose those who wish to break up this small island of ours. The very powerful words of Guy and yourself, Joti, have provoked in me some of the things that I've said in the past about Cuba before, but I think they are worth repeating. You, Joti, used a wonderful word. I wish I'd thought of it. Radiates. You talked about how Cuba radiates throughout the world. And that is undoubtedly true. This is a small island in the Caribbean of 11 million people that in 1959, in other words, in my own lifetime, I wish I could go there for my 50th birthday, Guy. Sadly, that is long past, not 3 years distant. But in my own lifetime, Cuba was, I think you can safely call it, a backwater of extreme poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment, and moreover was reduced during the period of the brute dictatorship of the General Batista to being a casino, a bordello for the American political class and their mafia aide-de-camps in some cases. Anyone who's seen The Godfather 1 and 2 knows what I'm talking about. The American politicians and the mafia gangsters and godfathers had big plans for the further development of that casino, that bordello. All of it brought crashing to the ground, and the flight of the dictator by the victory of the Cuban revolutionary forces in 1959, which would not have been possible but for the event that we commemorate today. Because the attack on the Moncada on the 26th of July 1953 was, like other such episodes, like the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, for example, a military failure, but a political success of absolute magnitude. If the revolution had not mounted the attack that it did in 1953, albeit unsuccessfully, it would not have triumphed in 1959. And all these achievements that we've all been talking about this evening, one or two of which I will add to. There are two slogans that stick in my mind from Cuba more than all the others. One of them is, walker, there is no path. The path is made by walking. In other words, revolutionary politics is a war of movement, not a war of position. And the other is, my favorite, this one, 120 million children in the world go to work instead of school every day. Not one of them in Cuba. Imagine that. A poor, developing country where not one child does not go to school. Not one child goes to work instead of school. And every child goes to school not just free. I don't know if everybody knows this, Joti. The Cuban children don't just still get milk every day that we used to get until Margaret Thatcher snatched it away in 1973, but they get a free school lunch as well as the milk. This is in a poor country. Every child goes to kindergarten, primary school, secondary school, university, specialist school for sports, specialist school for the arts, all of them entirely free and fed while they're there in a poor, developing country under siege. by the United States ever since 1959. How's that for an achievement? That is an achievement of world class. Not just Latin American class, not just developing country class. This compares favorably with every part of the world. And the health service of which you have been speaking, that rate of infant mortality that the ambassador described means that fewer children die at birth in Cuba than die in the United States of America, 90 miles away. Life expectancy in Cuba is longer than it is in the United States of America, 90 miles away. So the richest country in the world loses more children at birth, and its people live shorter lives than they live in independent and sovereign Cuba, 90 miles away from the Florida coast, despite an all-encompassing embargo that, as Guy referred to, is almost universally condemned annually by the United Nations. Even the British government does not support the United States blockade against Cuba. So on this, we're on the same page as Her Majesty's government when we denounce, as the overwhelming majority of states in the world do, this cruel and unusual and utterly counterproductive embargo, as Joti just described, necessity being the mother of invention. The Cubans have developed their biotech and pharmaceutical capacity precisely because of the embargo. They have developed their organic agricultural capabilities because of the American embargo. As I've said before, according to the laws of aerodynamics, the bumblebee cannot fly. Its body is too heavy, its wings are too small and slight, and yet it flies. And a beautiful sight it is too. By the laws of politics and economics, Cuba should not still be standing. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dark special period in which Cuba overnight lost 80% of its trade and all, virtually, of its oil supplies, Cuba's not just still standing almost 30 years later, but it's sending doctors to Italy and Spain and medical brigades all over the world. It's not just still standing, it is resplendent, radiating, in Joti's words, this goodness that drives the Yankees almost crazy into even self-disfiguring attempts to destroy the Cuban Revolution. But they have entirely failed, and they're not going to succeed now. I had the great honor for many years, decades in fact, of being a personal friend of the leader of the assault on Moncada and the leader of the Cuban Revolution, now deceased, the great President Fidel Castro. I had the honor to spend countless hours in his company, in private and in public, on television and in relaxed surroundings, listening to his incredible encyclopedic historical and political knowledge, his knowledge of the great figures of world history, good and bad, his close association with the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. Don't forget that when Nelson Mandela was freed, of all the countries in the world, most of them hypocrites, that wanted him to come and visit them, even though they had amongst them been the countries that propped up apartheid for decades. Nelson Mandela went straight to Cuba, to no other country before Cuba. Imagine that. And stood in Revolution Square with Fidel Castro, holding each other's hands aloft and declaring, "See how far we slaves have come." Because, of course, the internationalism of Cuba did not begin with the rescue teams that went around the world to help with the coronavirus, or even the rescue teams that have never been forgotten by the people of Pakistan and Kashmir, who arrived before anyone else to help the people suffering an earthquake, and who stayed longer than everyone else to help the people of another poor country, Pakistan and Kashmir, to rebuild their lives after that. But the internationalism of Cuba extended to leaving the bones of their people on the battlefield in Angola, Quinto Cuanavale, where they, along with the MPLA liberation fighters of Angola, defeated, decimated the army of apartheid South Africa and hastened the collapse of apartheid. And in many other parts of the world, Guy is wearing a beautiful Che Guevara sweatshirt there. Che Guevara was not a Cuban, but he was ready to give his life for the freedom of the people of Cuba. He was not an African, but he was ready to give his life alongside his comrade Patrice Lumumba and their forces. He was ready to give up his life in the Congo to fight imperialism there. He was not Vietnamese, but he fought in Vietnam with the heroic forces of liberation against imperial domination. He was not, of course, Bolivian, but he did leave his bones in Bolivia, fighting for the freedom of Bolivia. And I was privileged to be present in Santa Clara when Che Guevara's bones were returned from Bolivia. And Fidel Castro handed the casket to his daughter, Dr. Aleda Guevara, who promptly handed them back to Comandante Fidel and said, "These bones belong not to me, but to the people of Cuba." It was one of the most emotional moments of my life. I had the honor to be one of many biographers of Fidel Castro, and on the back page there, I hope you can see it, is my favorite photograph of all time. Fidel Castro was the greatest man I have ever met, and by a very long distance. Not more than once in 1,000 years does such a leader emerge. But he did not make the Cuban Revolution alone. Neither he and Che and Camilo and all the other leaders of the 26th July movement, they did not make this revolution alone. This revolution has been made by the Cuban people as a whole. 8 million of them armed There'll be no further Bay of Pigs. They talk idly or want you to believe they might invade Venezuela, but they will never invade Cuba, because 8 million armed Cubans would be ready for them on the beaches. Hasta la victoria siempre. Viva Fidel. Viva Cuba. Thank you very much for organizing this meeting, Joti.
Thank you, George. That was beautiful, really inspiring. And what an amazing thing to have been able to have an experience with someone like Fidel, have a relationship with him, to be able to talk to him privately as well as publicly and get insights into how he operated and how the Cuban Revolution was made. You know, the story of the Cuban Revolution reminds us, and particularly when George was talking, all the examples through all the decades of Cuba's internationalism, reminds us that our struggle, although it's based in our separate nations, we struggle where we are, but our struggle is a worldwide struggle. The workers, the oppressed peoples everywhere are struggling. They struggle separately and they struggle together for independence and freedom, for a world of social justice, of socialism. And each of our struggles gives strength to the other. You know, that's why the socialists have the slogan, united we stand, divided we fall. And we understand that not only that we must unite our class here at home, but that we must unite all of our struggles. Imperialism is a big and a strong enemy, but it's not stronger than the united power of the workers and oppressed peoples of the world. It's not. We are stronger, and history is on our side. You know, George reminded us of that beautiful Cuban slogan, Walker, there is no path, the path is made by walking. We're forging a new world, and we don't know exactly how our struggle is going to pan out, you know, every moment by moment. We don't know exactly how or when socialism will come, where first, last, in what way, how will it develop in Britain, how will it develop in France? But we know that it is the right path. And we know if we keep walking, we will get there. And if we walk together, we'll get there quicker. We in the Workers' Party are trying to forge that path, the path that will take the workers of Britain towards socialism, towards freedom, towards liberty, the path the Cuban people have been on for the last 60 or more years, and the path that workers all over the world are coming to realize is the only way to get to where they need to get, the only way we're going to get lives of dignity, peace, freedom, equality, meaning, value, real human lives. So we encourage you, please join us, swell our ranks, help us build a real movement to build socialism back in Britain, to build a movement that's capable of fighting for and achieving socialism, so that we can get up off our knees, make our mark, not only in Britain, but in the world, as we are capable of doing once we get ourselves organized. Thank you very much for joining us. Please go to our website, Workers' Party of Britain, or workerspartybritain.org, and join up. Follow us on Twitter, Workers' Party GB, and Facebook the same. And we'll see you again very shortly. And thank you again to all our speakers for a wonderful meeting.
Thank you.